afternoon UK time anyway, to everyone here and following this online. Well, it was a visit paid to London early last December by the EU Humanitarian Aid Commissioner Kristalina Georgieva that galvanized me into trying to persuade the BBC to let me go to the Sahel to cover what was then this developing crisis at first hand. I did an interview with her here and then used that in a piece that I did for the Today programme, and she didn't pull any punches at all in her warnings about how serious the crisis could be if there wasn't a much bigger international response than was the case at that time. And she also said that the time in which to speed up a properly targeted response was extremely short. And a month later, I did indeed go to Niger with, on top of what she'd said, a briefing from Echo's Brian O'Neill ringing in my ears. The 2012 Sahel crisis, which now a month on was deepening with each week that passed, was in a way, he said, a testbed for learning all the lessons that should have been learnt from previous emergencies in the Sahel and elsewhere, improving coordination in the response, pre-positioning food aid where it would be necessary, but at the same time not undermining local markets, predicting and dealing with bottlenecks in the delivery of aid and so on. You know that list well. Now, at that time in January, Niger, I think, was the key. The numbers affected were greater there than elsewhere in the Sahel. There were security issues there compounding all of those challenges. And there was a significant presence, of course, of humanitarian groups, many represented here. There was also a cooperative government in Niger, now in contrast to the past. And, of course, there was a recent history of crisis turning to catastrophe. And Brian O'Neill quoted an estimate of up to 250,000 deaths in the 2005 Niger famine, 250,000. And probably up to 50,000, he said, in the 2010 crisis. Now, to demonstrate that the response to such crises was getting better, this year's needed, he said, needed to be and should be contained much more effectively. But he also added his voice to the very many who say, how on earth is it that such a huge level of underlying chronic malnutrition and undernutrition, especially among children in Niger and elsewhere in the Sahel, appears to be tolerated, which I thought was a very strong point that he made that wasn't always said. Very obviously, the fact that you can argue it is tolerated, making it more difficult for those families and communities most affected by it to cope with and survive the shock of drought, of erratic rains, of crop pests, surging food prices, all the factors that have been seen in the region again this year. I spent a week or so in Niger, during which time Kristalina Georgieva visited and banged the drum again to call for a bigger and faster international response. I went to projects and places where UNICEF, WFP, Save the Children and others are working, and indeed I'm grateful to everyone involved. Everyone's message was essentially the same, that this was increasingly a race against time, with the traditional hunger season expected to start several months early, and indeed that it was just around the corner. There was no difficulty whatsoever in demonstrating that, the race against time, in our reports for BBC TV and radio and online. I particularly remember meeting a mother and a child at a clinic near Maradi and then walking home with them, and the mother told us how the harvest had given them only 10% of the food that her family would normally harvest from their plot, and how little they had to live on. There was still grain in the market in Maradi, she said, but they couldn't possibly afford to buy it. It really sort of emphasized how the food prices were such a big factor. Since then, of course, the crisis across the Sahel has become considerably more complex, with all the events in Mali, the coup, the seizure of the north by Islamist groups, and the refugee crisis that has triggered. So let us go first to David Gressley, the UN's regional humanitarian coordinator for the Sahel since April, and behind him a wealth of high-level experience in humanitarian operations. David, can you bring us up to date to give us a context for our discussions about specific responses and how vulnerability can be reduced and resilience increased. How do you see the state of things at the moment across the region, and what are the biggest priorities at present in your view?